I'm going to look at an example involving some string formatting. The example says, write a method CenterString word, which accepts a string word as a parameter and returns a string with the word centered in a string of length 10. If the length of the word is longer than 10, return the original word. If there is an extra space, add the extra space in front of the word. So what CenterString will do is center whatever the parameter that comes in between spaces so that the total length of the new string is length 10, unless the word itself is longer than 10, in which case CenterString will just return that word. Okay, so our pseudocode for this method, or even before we get to the pseudocode, what does the output look like? So if the word sent to it was metropolitan, metropolitan has length longer than 10, so the return value would just be the string metropolitan. Call of CenterString with the word help. Help has 4 letters, so we would need to put 3 letters in front and 3 spaces in front and 3 spaces behind the word help. So those dashes are representing spaces here. So we would put 3 before and 3 after. But if you called CenterString with the word hot, we would need a total of 7 spaces to have a total length of 10. So the extra space would go in front. We'd have 4 spaces in front, then the word hot followed by 3 spaces. Always good to know what your method is going to return. So the words are fine, but we should give it some value so we know what those words mean. And if it didn't give you this example here, it might not be a bad idea for us to generate that on our own before we even write any pseudocode or anything, just to make sure that we understand, what is the original problem asking us to do. Okay, so pseudocode. The easiest condition is that the length is greater than 10, because if that length is bigger than 10, we can just return that word, and the method is done. So if the word that you come in is has length bigger than 10, return that word and nothing else needs to happen. If its length is smaller than 10, meaning it gets to this other bit of code, we need to determine the total number of spaces that we need. If it's an odd number, we put additional space in front. If it's an even number, we put the same in front and the back. And then we need to pad that word. So we need to pad the spaces in front of the word, and we need to pad the spaces behind the word. Now, where does this stuff happen? Does it happen all at once? Does it happen sequentially, like I've outlined it here in the pseudocode? Not sure yet, but we'll jump into the coding and we'll see how it works out. And then finally, we'll return the word. Okay, so I'll jump over to Eclipse. I'm going to create a class called CenterText. Public static void main. Finish. Okay, so maybe I'll put some commenting in up here. In large part, mainly for me, I need this date so I can organize the content later. That helps you organize your content later as well. So we're creating a method. I'm not going to put what this class is doing because it's going to do a couple of things. I might come back and create other methods in a few minutes after we do the first one. So within main, we're going to just call this method. I forget what I called it. Let's double check. It's called CenterString. So main is going to call that method, and it's going to send it some string. So let's just pick a string to send it, metropolitan. And then we have to think about what the CenterString, does it have a return value? And in our case, it does. It returns a string. So we're going to set it up string, call it word equals, maybe we call this centered word or new word. I'm gonna just call it word. Padded word, I don't know. We'll see. We'll leave it at word for now and see what happens. So string word equals center string. Complaining because we haven't set up that method yet, but let's set it up. Public static, gonna return a string. We're accepting a parameter that's a string. You know, I could use like old word and new word here, but I'm just gonna use word again. And we're gonna understand that the scope of this word is within main, and the scope of this word is within center string. And you know, essentially, if I had to keep track of sort of the original word and the new word, I might make sure they're different. This could also create issues later if I'm trying to follow the scope. But let's see what happens if we just leave it. So this guy is giving me an error here because it wants me to return something. So let's just return the word at this point. Everything is fine. The logic is working. In our pseudocode, if word length is greater than or equal to 10, return the word. So literally here, if word, I need to change my pseudocode to code using the proper syntax. If word length is greater than or equal to 10, return the word. Because I'm putting a return statement within this if statement, I don't need to use an else here. You could think about else, you know, pad the word, but it won't get to the next bit of code unless the word length is less than 10. So I don't need the word else here. And then in terms of what's next, it says, well, let's determine whether we have, how many total spaces do we have? So how do we figure that out? Well, the spaces, so let's define an integer here. Spaces will equal, it's going to be what? 10 minus the length of the word. You know, I'm using the number 10 here twice. I think I could recognize that as a constant if I wanted to. And upstairs, I could define a final constant, 10. I'm not going to. I'm going to let 10 be the default value. Well, maybe we could set up public final, call it default equals 10. Static final integer default equals 10. Static final integer default equals 10. Why is that not liking that? It's not liking that because I need to put it in the class. Put it down here. Public static final default equals 10. And now where I have this 10, I can put the default here. Maybe I should call it default size or default length. So let's first type in default, and then I'll change the name of it. to default size. So underscore default and then underscore size or length. Default length. Okay. So if word length is greater than or equal to default length, which is 10, return the word. Here we're figuring out the number of spaces. Go back to our pseudocode for a second. If we have an odd number of spaces, we need one more in the front. If we have an even number of spaces, we put the same in the front or the back. So how do we check if something is even or odd? We can modular divide by 2 and compare that to 0. So if spaces mod 2 is 0, this would mean we have an even number of spaces. Then let's set up 2 method calls here. The first one will replace word with the pad the front. The second one will replace with the pad behind. And then I need to tell it not only the word, but also how many places to put in front or how many places to put behind. So if I'm padding the front and it's an even number of spaces, then I need to pad it with the spaces divided by 2. Otherwise, let's not worry about padding behind right now. So that's padding the front if it's an even number of spaces. Else, what do we want to do? We want to pad behind it. No, pad the front with, well, let's see. So it's reaching here because spaces is not divisible by 2. So we would take spaces divided by 2. That's an integer 1 less than the number of spaces we need in front, and add 1 to it. Think about that logic for a second. If spaces is an even number, so say 6, 6 mod 2 is 0, so it will pad the word with 3 spaces in front, spaces divided by 2. Otherwise, that would mean that spaces is an odd number, so the word will get padded in front with, well, so let's say it was 7. 7 divided by 2 with integer division is going to be 3, and 3 plus 1 will be 4. So in terms of the iterative process, we should program that function, pad front, and let's tighten up center string a little bit. So I can see what level that function would go. So this function is here, pad front, public, static. This is also going to return a string. It has 2 parameters. The first one is a string, that's our word. The second one is the number of spaces. So let's just call it space. Let's see, integer. Let's call it number. I don't want to use the word space or spaces here because here I'm dividing the spaces by 2. So I'm just using the word number. And then I won't actually write this yet. I'll just return the word again. Make sure that our logic is strong. So what happens after I pad the front? Then I need to pad the back. So how do we pad the back? Well, the back always has the same number of spaces. Doesn't matter whether you have an even number of spaces or an odd number of spaces. It's always going to be adding the spaces, integer divided by 2. If you think about whether you have 7 spaces or 6 spaces, 7 divided by 2 is 3, 6 divided by 2 is 3 when you're doing integer division. So then I can set that function up at the same level as this one. Public static, again, it returns a string, pad behind, same parameters, accepts that word, and an integer, and it returns, I'm going to write, for right now, just return the word. So all I've done is sort of set the logic up so that center string will work. This a little bigger for us. I'm using pretty big font, so it's hard to see too much of the code at a time. Go back up to main. All main does is call center string. If the word length is bigger than 10, in this case, the default length, return that word. Figure out how many spaces we need. If that's an even number, pad the word in front with spaces divided by 2. Otherwise, pad the word in front with spaces divided by 2 plus 1. Once that's done, pad the word behind with the number of spaces divided by 2. And once that's done, return the word from the method altogether. Okay, so then padding in front and padding behind are pretty straightforward because you just need to run a loop for integer I equals 0, 1. Let's go with 1. I less than or equal to the number. Increase by 1 each time. We place the word by adding a space in front of it. So word equals space plus word. And then as soon as that method is, as soon as that loop is over, return the word. Might be kind of hard to see the spaces, so maybe I'll put dashes in it originally, kind of like I did on the pseudocode, and then at the end we can replace the dashes with spaces, because dashes are easier to count probably than spaces. And then, you know, I could test this right now, or I could go ahead and do pad word behind. I don't think there's that much difference. For integer I starting at 1, I less than or equal to the number, I plus plus. You know, what I haven't given much thought to is this the right amount of spaces? Word equals the word that we started with. Now I'm going to pad the space, or in this case, a dash behind the word. Meaning, you know, should this be a less than? Should this be a less than or equal to? My feeling is it should be a less than or equal to starting at 1. If it doesn't work, we would look in there and see if something needed to be adjusted. Okay, so let's run it, see what happens. Pad the front, pad behind. In both cases, we return it. This one's not going to be very interesting because, oh, we didn't do anything. In main, we didn't print anything. So let's come back here and print this word. And again, in this example, I'm plugging in the word metropolitan, so it shouldn't do anything to the word except output metropolitan. In terms of testing, what else should we do to test it? Well, we can change this to the word help. So that should have 3 spaces before and 3 spaces after. Dash, 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 help, dash, 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 it does. And then helping, or I guess I did hot, so that would have 4 spaces before and 3 spaces behind. Space, 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 3 behind. Notice the dashes make our life a lot easier to check this. When I go back in here and change these to spaces and run it, I mean, it does the same thing, it's just harder to see what's going on. So I think I'll just leave it as dashes. And then, you know, it's easier to check it and see what's going on. Okay, so I'm going to come back in. I'm going to pause for a second. I think I'll make my font a little smaller so I can get the whole code on here. All right, so we go back in. I'm going to look through the code again. I set up a constant default length of 10. In main, I put a call to center string, putting different inputs in here to test it, and I put a print statement in to print that return value to see if it's working. Up in center string, if the word length was greater than or equal to the default length, just return the word. Then it never gets to here unless it is shorter than that length. So when it's shorter, take the default length and subtract the length of the word you're given. Modular divide by 2 to see if it's even. If it is even, pad the front of the word with the spaces divided by 2, and this is an integer division by an even number, so we will get an even, the right number of spaces in front. Else, it means we started with an odd number, so pad that by spaces divided by 2 plus 1. And then once the front is padded, we then need to pad behind, and the behind always gets padded by spaces integer divided by 2, and then return the word. So the code for pad front and pad behind is similar. We take in a word and an integer representing the number of spaces. In this case, I just used dashes so we could see them easier. For a for loop running those number of spaces, put a space in front to pad the front, and then return the word. And to pad behind, put the space behind, and then return the word. So that's our code. I could modify this code to have another method with the same name, center string, but instead of having the default length of 10, I could let it be a variable length. So I will do that in the next video.